All right. So hopefully you've all had a chance to grab the book, start reading chapter 1. We'll be covering chapter 1 for a good while here. Anybody else not get a syllabus who came in that need one? Everyone has one? All right. Well, today we're going to dive into a lot of kind of general information, I guess is how I would describe it. Big picture, just introducing you all to the field of geography. The book makes great pains to kind of just talk about how we're all kind of geographers, right? You know, if you think about how you store things in, how do you know where your belongings are, right? It's geographically usually. It's like, okay, inside the house, over here I have this, over there I have that, right? You think about things and where they are. Oh, and as I said before, I have a simpler version of these slides on our class website, but I have extra stuff when I do the actual lecture. The stuff is kind of minimal just for your notes that you could load up that's on our Canvas site. So geography, what is it? Well, as you can see, it's a lot of stuff, right? It's a lot of stuff. I always think of it as, you know, people have their different subfields, right? Some people interested in political science, some people are interested in like climatology. These are things that are all seemingly very disconnected, but geography is how we see how they're all connected. And we can see a big picture of how all these different things come together. And you know, if you took classes further on in geography, if some of you are maybe taking a GIS class, you'll do things that are more specializations of these different subfields. But in a class like this, even though this is human geography as opposed to physical geography, well, the human and the physical come together a lot. I'll show you some examples about how we have to take the physical into account when we're talking about human geography. Geomorphology, that was one of the words that was on the last slide there. That's just one of those big long words that geography textbooks will throw at you. 6 explanations for the shape, origin, spatial distribution, and development of terrain features of all kinds, as well as processes that create, modify, or destroy landforms. So for example, when we're studying geography, you know, a picture like this, you know, nature, and you don't think about, well, how is this related to culture? Well, there's lots of different ways, right? There are subcultures, if you will, of going and climbing mountains. The landscape here, though it seems natural, most of the landscapes in the United States have been made and remade, right? There's been a lot of deforestation, especially in the early development years, lots of efforts to bring back trees in later years, things like that shape what we call our cultural landscapes. So if you look at this picture, you're thinking, well, this is just a natural landscape. We could call it a cultural landscape because most landscapes are still affected by the cultures that live on them. This textbook also has you do a lot of what it calls the detective work of geography, which is, well, you look at your data, which in geography it's often maps. Maps are often satellite imagery, right? That's your data set. And it says, well, the detective work of trying to figure out, also analysis of photography. There's a lot of that in this textbook as well, where they say, well, look at this picture and pick it apart. What's going on here? What are the processes? What can we identify? So 2 images here. Now, if I say that these are of the same location, just these different years, and if I say light green is new growth and dark green is old growth, could anyone hazard a guess as to what's going on here? Yeah.
Just urban development?
Urban development is a very good guess. I would say this is what happens in a earlier phase of pre-urban development. You'd probably be able to guess pretty easily if I said that this is in the middle of the Amazon, right? Deforestation. Deforestation, of course, is a very cultural thing. So, for example, in Brazil right now, they have an administration that is a bit actually more on the pro-cutting down the rainforest side as a development technique to bring in foreign capital with all the wood. The presidential administration that was before him was more of a save the rainforest type of administration, right? And so the culture has kind of shifted within Brazil itself. And there's always this kind of, well, to stay with the example of Brazil, there's this fight over development versus preservation, and it really goes back and forth. And if you look at this a little bit closer, well, you can see that the deforestation happens in these lines. That's just because, well, if you're gonna be logging an area, the easiest is right next to roads, right? And so those are the first places deforested. And the government could be part of putting in those roads, which would then lead to deforestation, or not, right? All kinds of things coming together. I don't need to read all that. So this is another, it's a data set. This is the type of data we use in geography. Just eyeballing it, what's being mapped here? We could say in the back.
Cell towers, maybe?
What's that?
Maybe like cell towers?
Cell towers. That's a decent guess. I would say go more simple.
Light?
Yeah.
Light pollution?
Yeah, could call it light pollution or just light. Lights at night, right? And one of the interesting things about a pattern like this, well, if you do like a deep analysis, you could see a number of different patterns that emerge, right? You could probably try to figure out major urban areas, right? If you look at these patterns, can you see the Twin Cities where that is, right? The Chicago, Twin Cities here. And you can see why, well, when people who are locals, including people in different states, if they say to each other, well, I'm going into the cities this weekend, right? That's a term that's used. Well, they mean the Twin Cities because regionally, right, they're kind of the biggest hub. If you really did a deep dive and looking at the patterns here, I think you could also see what appear to be maybe major road networks. If you see some lines, right? So when we're looking at different data, images or what have you, there's often a lot more analysis than kind of your preliminary view of it is, right? Something else interesting when we're looking at, well, we're going to look at a ton of maps, obviously, in this class. There was a time that fire ants were in the news a lot because it was seen that they were an invasive species and a new problem in the United States as they hadn't been here before. And there are these predictions that through time that they would overtake the United States. And this is a little bit further in the future from that. And this is actually, well, this is 20 years ago now that these predictions were being made. I think that there's similar things within the past couple of years looking at bees as invasive species that have come in from different areas. But they did not take over the whole United States. They took over a good range of space, but there are certain places that they had a natural threshold they were not going to be able to cross. Does anyone guess what that is? What stopped the ants?
Like cold weather?
Yeah, places with a good freeze would kill them off, right? And although And again, connecting physical geography with cultural geography, the reason that these ants that are usually from a warmer climate were able to move into area further north is in general the climate has been warming a bit. But of course, obviously, as we know here in Minnesota, we still get plenty of freeze, right? We still get plenty of really cold days. So that's a limiting factor, at least for now. And this is also just an example of how when we do an analysis of trends and try to predict the future, which is often the thing we're trying to do when we're looking at data, can often be wrong if you don't do a real thorough analysis, right? Simple patterns on a map of a species kind of moving in, well, superficial analysis, again, like I said, the newspapers are saying it's going to take over the whole United States, but it's not in fact what happened. Another example here, another before and after picture, but it's not years apart. This is about a day apart. Anyone able to kind of take a stab at what happened at this place? Yeah.
Forest fires? Or you just like
That's a decent guess, but it's not forest fire. Yeah.
a volcano eruption?
That's another decent guess, especially since we had one recently, yeah.
Is it like a tsunami or increase in tide?
A tsunami. You know that the recent volcano that was in the news, a tsunami, in case anyone doesn't know, a giant wave, right, that's created from, it could be a volcano, it could be an earthquake, can even be an underwater avalanche of the land shifting will create a displacement of water, right? This volcano that went off recently, people were a bit worried because it did create a big tsunami wave. The wave itself ended up only being about 3 or 4 feet, which for most places were just a bit of an annoyance. For islands that were near it that are only like a foot or two above sea level, and I don't know if there's plenty of people who have visited islands. There's lots of islands that's what their altitude is, just barely above sea level. A wave of just a couple feet can do a lot more damage. This example, this is 2004 Thailand, and how does this come together with culture, nature? Well, this was a while ago. There's better warning systems these days for things like tsunamis, because usually you could tell within hours and give people plenty of notice. And it all depends on the systems at the places that well, let's say that you're in the future, you'll be vacationing maybe someday at a beach. Or maybe if you've gone to a beach recently, you might have seen signs saying tsunami evacuation zone, and it will have kind of arrows, and it might point down a road. Well, that infrastructure is expensive. So there's lots of places that, although we have the technology for these warning systems, there's plenty of places that just don't have it. And that was the case in this example, because what happened when there's a tsunami wave, displacement of water, right? So a big wave. So a big wave displaces water. So water before and after a wave actually sinks down. And so what happened here is you had a nice tropical beach, a lot of people just hanging out at the beach. And the water came down quickly. And that's before you see a wave or anything is even near you. The water will come on down. And what happened was, well, you know, you're taking this class, so you will know if you're on a beach and the water goes down, that's a bad sign. No one there knew that. People, the opposite, they thought it was interesting. They would walk down to the shallow areas and, you know, they'd be like, oh, look at this boat that sank, and now we could see it and look at it, and isn't that interesting, and that kind of thing. And so it was a lot of people killed, right? A lot of people killed. That if this happened today, it would hopefully be a different scenario. I will say that Thailand itself has spent a lot of money putting in more alarm infrastructure and stuff. One interesting thing, if you look at these maps, Or if you've ever seen yeah.
How long did you say was the timetable between those two pictures?
I believe it was like 2 or 3 days.
How does it get like the charred look on the right?
That's a good question. I think that is just the vegetation after it's been knocked over and just kind of sitting for a while. I don't know if I would say it had rotted away, but you can see there's a number of places where the vegetation is relatively untouched, even though it's right next to the water. That's because, well, higher elevation. Very often people who survive tsunamis, you could try to make a run for it, but you're not going to really outrun a tsunami. So if you have the option to get in higher elevation, that's kind of a thing that I would prioritize. Because you could walk, as you can see, this whole area got damaged well on down that track. The other part of our textbook saying that we're all born geographers is that it's part of our nature to think spatially, right? Even pre-human peoples, as well as humans who made wall art, right, in caves and whatnot, they would have images of animals, and it would often be animals that actually weren't in that area. But there would be indications of amounts of distances for different types of animals that were of interest, obviously, to these map makers. And so this is more of what we would call a mental map or a conceptual map, right? Those were kind of like the first main maps people started to put together very simply from the dawn of time, basically. All right. So down to the nitty-gritty specifics. What is human geography? Study of relationships between humans and the spaces in which they live. All right. This helps us understand the diverse spatial arrangements we see around us in homes, cities, parks, states, so on. So we'll do an in-depth analysis of all these different things. Cultural approach to human geography emphasizes meaning, values, attitudes, and beliefs that different groups of people lend to and derive from spaces and places, right? Spaces and places, and what do they mean for different people? A lot of these key terms are thrown at you fast in this book, and most of these terms we're going to use again and again, so you'll get used to what they mean. Don't feel like you need to lock down every single one right away. All right, so what is culture? A variety of human behavioral traits that are learned which help people communicate beliefs, practices, meanings, and values that influence behavior. Cultural geographers examine the meaning, values, attitudes, and beliefs that different groups lend to derive from spaces they inhabit and move through. And so culture itself is a process, right? It's people doing things. Sometimes we'll think of it as the objects that are cultural objects, but it's people making and remaking the world and the world around us. This is kind of one of the unique skills that humans have more than other animals. All animals attempt to use the earth and recreate things for their own use to the amount that they can, right? Like a bird will make a nest and so on and so forth. But humans are just kind of like, just way better, more involved at that process. So as I said, culture is a process, not static. It kind of, again, it'll seem that way because as we look through time, it's difficult to see these changes, but we'll be looking at the changes. So people engaging with culture, changing their beliefs and practices over time and space. Geographers seek to understand how cultures change, how they differ, and how they are the same, and how this differs between place, right? There's always either difference or repetition, right? Either something is copied something that you're doing, how you're dressed, whatever your clothes. You're either copying something or you're doing something different, right? These are pictures from the book of just how buildings that serve the same purpose can be culturally very different if they're in different places and different contexts, right? This term is actually usually called globalization. When you have something that is kind of global, like you could have a specific religion that's global. On this picture is not from the book, I just grabbed this one myself. But again, you can see very stylistically different depending on the place that these are located in, right? Our cultures shape these things. Culture and the physical environment. Well, that's why I started out with those physical environment examples. Understanding the distribution of culture often requires an understanding of geography of the physical environment, because there are limits to where things can be, right? Climate, plants, soil, terrain, bodies of water. So to bring all these things together, the textbook talks about the cultivation of wheat, right? And what are the determining factors of, well, where is wheat? Where is it farmed? People know much about wheat? Anyone know much about the agricultural revolution? Yeah?
After a while, when they started planting wheat, they noticed that if they repeatedly planted just wheat, it would erode the topsoil, making it infertile. And so they ended up learning to rotate their crops.
This is true. As you can see, wheat is obviously like a worldwide phenomenon, worldwide crop. Where's it from? It was at one time. It was one plant at one place. Kind of crazy. Anyone know?
Middle East?
Middle East. It's part of the reason this area is called the Fertile Crescent, right? Right by Iraq and whatnot. And you're right that wheat cultivation, especially in the earlier days, it would exhaust soils. And that's something that humans have actually done again and again. A lot of the areas where wheat was first cultivated, where they had the revolution of like, boy, if we put these seeds back here and they'll grow back and we could just have reliable crop that you could just do so much with. Well, in places that was invented, you had soil degradation and they couldn't actually grow the crops there anymore. So people and the practices moved. And as you can see, well, it's not just the people who are here who moved and brought it elsewhere. They also taught people as they moved around, and people learned it, and the knowledge of it spread. And in the Dust Bowl, it was a similar thing where you had places that had soils that were just a bit too dry. And if you irrigate in places that are semi-arid, aren't desert, but they're a bit drier, if you irrigate, you could get lots of crops for a number of years, but it's not long before it kind of degrades. So wheat production, right? It's a crop, so we connect it with nature, but obviously it's humans who are bringing it all these places, right? Because we find it so useful. And it's humans who are then doing different things, like sometimes degrading the soil, sometimes trying to rehabilitate the soil, making different varieties of wheat. Different countries will give different subsidies for the production of wheat, right? To make food less expensive. So humans are culturally very involved in this spread of the geography of wheat. And of course this comes together with actual physical geography and things like climates and soils, because there's just actual limitations to obviously where wheat could be. It's not going to be in the middle of the ocean. It's not super likely to be in the middle of a desert, so on and so forth. All right. How do we classify culture? Well, you either have non-material culture or material culture. And when we try to look at historical cultures and try to figure out what were they doing, what were their priorities, what were they up to? Well, we mostly have to look at their material culture remains, right? very often what we dig through and find is, well, things that past societies thought of as refuse, right? You have people who will dig that stuff up, trying to figure out what made those people tick. Like the first settlements, agriculture in the Middle East, enabled the first dense settlements as well. And we basically dig through all the junk that they left behind, trying to piece together what they were about. And we use material culture to be more specific. Visible objects that comprise culture, clothes, food, houses, art, musical instruments, so on and so forth. The stuff, right? We're making physical stuff. Now, the thing that is much more difficult to tell through time, or even through different places, is non-material culture, right? The beliefs, values, and myths and symbolic meanings passed from generation to generation of a given society. The non-material culture, it's interesting because it's a very strong thing, because everybody interacts with non-material culture, right? We all have thoughts and beliefs and myths and information, stuff that is passed down generation by generation, but sometimes these processes can be interrupted, right? And culture can be lost. You might have read in the news, they'll talk about how different languages are dying out, right? Because people are using more popular languages. Those parts of non-material culture can just vanish and never be seen again. All right, when we're looking at culture, we're going to look a lot at folk culture and a lot at popular culture. So folk culture, well, as it says, associated with traditional ways of life in rural and agricultural spaces. Very often a reaction to urbanization, industrialization that are changing cultural practices. So that when there are people worldwide who kind of protest against globalization, there's different reasons people do this. Some people, they protest against it because they see it as spreading of economic inequality, right? And values from other places that they don't agree with. And sometimes it will make different societies kind of double down on their specific folk cultural traditions as a way to combat what they might see as kind of neo-colonialism, right? An example would be, well, much of the internet is in English, right? And so if you want to interact with a lot of different internet sites and stuff, well, you need some amount of knowledge of English, right? And this can be something that, well, as I said before, languages can die off in different places, but you have a reaction sometimes where places will say, you know what, our language is not going to die off. We're going to make specific rules about our language. This is actually the French are most known for this type of thing. So for example, when the term CDs, right, compact discs, call them CDs, when CDs were first kind of becoming a big thing, they made a law in France that you could not call a CD a CD. You had to call it whatever the French word was, which I don't remember what it was now. But they had rules about it, and places do that all the time, right? Folk culture. Let's see. Well, when you're thinking about folk culture, think about not mass-produced, right? Locally produced, right? By individuals, handcrafted, right? In our modern society, there's not a lot of that around anymore, all right? Sometimes there is. You can have buy maybe purse that's handmade in Italy or something. It's not impossible to find these kinds of things. Oh yeah, the last bit here. Non-material practices are localized, passed down through generations with distinct music and forms of storytelling. Things that are passed down. I'll just give you a couple of kind of examples of how these things come together. When I went to Egypt, one of the first places that we stopped, we actually just pulled over to get some gas. And when we pulled over, the guy said I should take a picture of him and his camel. so I did. But it was a group of people that I think we would have described as like traditional, right? This isn't like modern popular international culture. And it was kind of interesting because, well, as we were there, the tourists, many tourists thought that these, kids and goats riding donkeys were pretty adorable. So a lot of people on the tour bus went and got photos and would give people little amounts of money because, it is very cute. But it was interesting because as we stayed there and our tour guide went and checked in with them, see how cute this is? Our tour guide also gave them money and spoke to them, and we found out that this is not how these people actually normally dress. That they were kind of performing culture for us, in a way. When you get into the city in Cairo, people wearing blue jeans, sunglasses, right? Different, right? Not folk culture stuff. All right, types of culture, indigenous cultures. So indigenous peoples are self-identified peoples whose social, cultural, and economic conditions distinguish them from the national society of the country in which they live. Right? Indigenous people were colonized where their territory was appropriated, controlled, and occupied by a geographically distant power. And this process happens and has been happening for thousands of years. Ancient empires made colonies. Modern empires made colonies. They take over places and take stuff from places, move their own people into places. Very often, an empire thinks of itself as superior to other places in all ways, and that usually is culturally. So if you have an empire, let's just say the Mongolian Empire, just to pick one, the Mongolian Empire stretched a long area of land, right? Mongolia today is a bit of a minor power, not a large population, but you have people of Mongolian descent who live in the Middle East, and they were part of the early colonization when the Mongolian Empire, when they took over territory, they would bring their own people in to basically administer it and have control and take resources back to the center of that empire, right? So through time, when we're talking about indigenous cultures, they tend to be minorities in their own homelands. Indigenous cultures, material and non-material characteristics share similarities with folk culture, but their political histories and geographies set them apart. This is just some more Egypt, since I was already looking at my Egypt pictures. This is some kind of folk handcrafted goods that you could still buy in places around the world, right? All right. Types of culture, popular culture. This is actually a bit more studied in geography, I think, than folk culture, although both are studied quite a bit. Modern material and symbolic practices are associated with the rise of mass-produced machine-made goods and the invention of long-distance communication technologies, right? So when we started mass-producing stuff, right, mass-producing, if you're going to mass-produce stuff, especially if you think of the early days of industrialization, what you're talking about is, let's say shoes as an example. Before industrialization, you wanted to buy some shoes. You went to someone whose last name might have been shoemaker, because last names that people have today very often are connected to the job that their family had. You'd go to them and they would look at your feet and set a price, and they would make shoes specifically for your feet and that you picked out the things about them, right? Very specific, not a quick process, right? When we switch to industrialization, mass producing things, it tends to be a simpler thing, So shoes, first industrialization of making shoes, they would be very simple, but you could make a ton and make them for super cheap. That was kind of the point of industrialization. Make a ton of the stuff and make it super cheap so that everyone could have 10 pairs of shoes, right? Instead of just one that you got to take back to the shoe maker every time it gets a problem with it. So pop culture is consumer oriented, meaning their identity is constructed by purchase and consumption of mass-produced commodities. A lot of different subcultures are actually based around commodities that people will buy that they share an interest in, right? So let's say you have a group of people who are sailboat enthusiasts, right? It's a bit more of an expensive hobby probably, but you know, their subculture would be based around a material possession that they buy, that they then communicate about, and they would have their own words and language that they would use to talk about their subculture that the rest of us would be like, I don't know what those words are, you know? All right. Popular culture is also characterized by placelessness, where the standardization of the built environment reduces or eliminates the uniqueness of specific locations. This is actually a bit of a problem with popular culture in that if you travel, or to be more specific, if you've traveled for a good amount of time, such as myself, traveled for many, many years, I have found through time, cities in different areas of the world are it's actually, I think it's called convergence hypothesis. They're becoming more similar to each other. Whereas, so, you know, you could have a city like Minneapolis, St. Paul, right? Somewhat major cities, and you could go to, I don't know, Berlin in Germany, right? And you might have more in common with someone who's living in the city in Berlin than you might have in common with someone who lives in a rural area of your own state, right? So placelessness, actually there's some pictures I think. Oh, actually this is from the textbook here. Examples of the general placelessness, right? And the tough thing is different places will often want to sell themselves as places for people to go and spend money, but it's difficult when they all are so similar to each other. So this is actually kind of a big conflict in modern society where places are trying to branch out and do things that say, no, we're distinct from other places because we have this stuff going on. But tourists also expect these things when they go visit your town. So there's also a demand for these things that, again, create more of a sense of placelessness. This was in Egypt, where they had McDonald's delivery, which was, I found that a bit of a surprise. Lots of places around the world, they deliver fast food because less people have cars, so you're not as likely to go through the drive-through, but this is still getting the food to you. But, you know, it's kind of interesting because McDonald's, fast food restaurants, that's an example of placelessness because how they are just kind of everywhere. But at the same time, if you actually go to McDonald's in different places, they have different food. Like in Egypt, you know, you have hummus and falafel, right? And you have pita bread. If you go to the McDonald's locally here, I probably don't have that stuff. All right. Cultural diversification. How are difference and change reinforced by geography? Well, we're reinforced lots of ways, right? Segregation. Sometimes people choose to be separate. Sometimes people are forced to be separate. Relocation, mobility, connection to a homeland, right? Very often when people migrate to a country, their identity will be very tied to the previous place that they're with. Their children, though, a bit less so. And then those grandchildren, they often will have just no connection with the country that population came from anymore, right? So subcultures are often resistant to the dominant culture, creating distinct identities and reinterpreting mass-produced goods. Right, so punk culture, this is the example used in the book. It's a subculture, and, well, punk uses, obviously, products that other people can buy and have access to, but use them in different, unique ways as a way of kind of identifying their subculture. Subcultures are an interesting thing, very popular area for people to study in geography. Can people think of any other subcultures? These would be things that are within our culture, but set themselves as being distinctly different from the popular mass culture. Can anyone think of anything? It's a tough one. Well, as I mentioned, the sailboat enthusiasts, these subcultures are often tied to their material, non-material culture, right? Could there be a subculture focused on like country music? Is that like a whole different genre and a different type of person? Maybe? Yeah.
I don't know, maybe like surfer people.
Oh, I think that's a good one. Surfer people, right? That's the other thing too, is like people outside of those cultures don't know how to identify them usually. It's like we just call them surfer people, I guess. They probably have better names for themselves, or maybe not. Any other subcultures people can think of? There's a ton of them.
What about like hippie culture?
Exactly, very good one, right? If I say someone is a hippie, you'll get an image in your head that, well, it may not be exactly what that person actually is, but it's closer than nothing, right? Yeah, that's good. Subcultures. So in human geography, and in this book, we're going to be looking at three perspectives. Spatial modeling, which we've already done a fair amount of. Humanistic perspective, and social theoretical perspective. We'll go through these each. And each chapter goes through all these each too. So spatial modeling, right, draws upon physics and geography, right, emphasizes the study of space as an abstract geometric property that can be scientifically modeled through the application of universal laws, right? Examples of transportation systems, urban settlement patterns, social services delivery, right? These are spatial modeling. These are ways that we could look at space. You could look at, well, I think the example they use is from Brazil. This is what the center of an urbanized area of Latin America. This is a model of what they look like. Now, you wouldn't go to any specific place in Latin America, go to a city, and this is the map of it. But this is in general how things are distributed, right? Commercial central business district, not unlike a lot of American cities, right? You have elite residential, which is the wealthy people, right? They'll be living nearest where they can do their shopping and going to work usually, right? What else we got? Zone of maturity, gradually improved, upgraded, self-built housing. I think we might call these more of like the suburbs. Suburbanization is not something that just happens here. Suburbanization is one of those things that has really become international. Lots of places are getting suburbs. Something in this area, zone of peripheral squatter settlements and slum housing, right? These are, if you ever see places that have shanty towns, what happens is, and we used to have shanty towns here in the Twin Cities. Major American cities used to have large, sprawling shanty towns. What happens is, worldwide, jobs in rural areas are tending to decrease, and the wages are going down, right? Part of that is because industrialization of farming, right? It makes, well, harder and harder for individual farmers to compete with large agro businesses. So people are losing their livelihood and they're moving to cities because, well, if you lose your job somewhere and there's not another job, you move. In the United States, this happened, and there was a flood of people into cities. A lot of documentation of early New York talked about this. But what you have is you have people who, well, they have to leave where they are. They come to a city looking for work. They can't afford to live near where the jobs and work are, so they try to make some self-built housing where they can, using what they can. And sometimes in Latin America, like this zone here that is kind of the suburban area, often that was a shanty town that has been upgraded through time. The people have moved there, and sometimes they've now lived there for generations, and they've had lots of time to build up, and they put in roads and put in power and upgrade the whole grid, right? That's urbanization process we'll talk about a relatively good amount. As I said, we're looking at these three different perspectives. Humanistic perspective, right? The humanistic perspective in human geography is more of the arts side, right? Draws from literature, visual arts, history. Humanistic perspective examines human agency, creativity, and subjective human experiences, seeks to understand meaning and value and how that shapes people's lives, focuses on place and how people make meaning and value in their interactions with locations, and how places can evoke a strong emotional reaction or a sense of place, which is a term we'll come back to again and again. Examples: memorials, neighborhoods, cemeteries. In geography, actually, there's a big subdiscipline looking at memorials specifically, and how much meaning they have for different people in different places. It really kind of depends. When I went to France this last summer, I visited Normandy, which is a big place during World War II, big invasion place. And they have a giant cemetery for many, many thousands of American dead who died during the Normandy invasion. And it was interesting because when I was there, well, I was there as a tourist, didn't really know that much about the memorial actually before I went. And like I said, it was a big cemetery as well. But it was interesting because there, locally, the culture was still really tied to the invasion at the end of World War II. Because, for example, churches had their stained glass windows smashed out by bombs and mortars and all kinds of things. Well, when they rebuilt them, it was interesting because I was looking at them. They rebuilt them, and a lot of them have little military people in parachutes with angel wings on them because they saw the United States coming in and kicking out the Nazis as angels falling from the sky, right? It was interesting how these things had changed the meaning of the place through time. This is a World War II memorial picture from the book. All right, so of our different models, social theoretical perspective, right? Surveys, interviews, participant observation. Well, social theoretical perspective asks questions about the balance of power in society and the inequalities defined by gender, race, ethnicity, class, and sexuality, right? We look at how places are different from each other, often based on these specific attributes. Balances human agency and attention to social structures beyond individual control. What that means is a lot of geography is looking at big picture, again, structures that shape our lives. But the field of geography always wants to include that there is human agency. There are these larger structures that kind of feel like they control our lives, but also realistically at any point we could all just decide we don't like that thing and we could stop doing it, right? Like we actually individually have complete power over these things that seem to kind of like rule our lives. Well, that's a simple version of it. we'll get into it more later. Examines how ideology relates to place, environment, and landscape. Examples: national identity expression, connection to land, contestation over public spaces, social hierarchies. Contestation over public places is actually a big area in geography, just because, well, public spaces tend to be, we'll say, commodified. They tend to be prioritized what makes money in those places over necessarily how people want to use those places, right? Well, we'll get into examples as we get into the class. Visualization tools of human geography. This is a lot of info here. This is basically saying we're going to look at maps, right? We're going to look at a lot of maps, visualization tools, right? A lot of maps. Now maps, every time we look at them, we're going to look at them with a bit of a critical eye, because any map, a map is a product of the map maker, right? We'll look at it and there's a tendency to think, well, this is the information that I need to see and this is how it's expressed. But it's all specifically, selectively compiled for you, right? The book also talks about, well, like I said, that first thing was like, oh, there's lines of longitude and latitude. Hopefully people kind of know the basics of how we theoretically break up the Earth surface into these different lines, right? And that's how we tell where places are. Lines of latitude, lines of longitude, north, south, east, west. These lines are used for lots of different types of things, including things like time zones. Although lines of longitude and latitude, well, they tend to be straight, right? And of course, these lines are not so straight. That's because, of course, culture gets in there, right? So culturally, China decided it wanted to be one time zone, right? Even though it's a large space. The United States instead, right, we're like, well, we'll be different time zones, and that might make things difficult in different times or whatever. You'll cross a time zone and a place is closed or whatever. You can see these types of things. You know, Russia, there's no way that they would have been able to have one time zone, right? Because it's just too long this way of a place. These lines of longitude and latitude, these are actually the basis of our definitions of what property lines are. We've divided the United States up by these lines. The book also talks about GPS, global positioning system. Like, you know, kind of the basics of that kind of thing. What time does this class go to again? 12 exactly? Okay. Where was I? Oh, yes. Well, the system of dividing up property by lines of longitude and latitude, you could really kind of see this on the landscape when you're flying over, right? And you see things like farmland. It's like, oh yeah, that's definitely split up into these cubes. Different types of maps, they're called different projections. And they're called projection because, well, it's as if you put a piece of paper on a globe and you had a light bulb in the middle, right? And the shadows are on this. So, for example, cylindrical projection, Mercator map projection is one of the most commonly used in the world, but that is correct around the equator, but the further you get from the equator, the more stretched out it is because, well, you're taking a round thing and representing it with a flat thing. These are the most popular map projections that there are. And they're more controversial than you might imagine. The Mercator projection was kind of like the big popular map for the whole 20th century, right? And the Mercator projection, this is a map that leans toward wanting to have the shapes of countries correct, but not the sizes, right? Because it's accurate around the equator, and then the further up you go, the more it stretches places out, right? And so what that means is, well, a Peters projection, it wants places to be the right size, but not the right shape. The right size is the priority, right? And so these are the accurate sizes of things. So the reason this is controversial is, this is the big map during the whole 20th century. The later half of the 20th century, there were two main countries that were kind of making all the maps for the world, the United States and the Soviet Union. And they both, with this projection, look a lot bigger than they are, right? It's like, well, those places are not that big. If you look at an equal area projection, see, all of Europe could fit into a tiny little corner of Africa, right? But with this projection, it makes it look like, oh, this is a big place. Look how big this place is. It's big and scary, big place. Most maps that you'll see these days are a Robinson projection. It's kind of funny because, well, like I said, this map prioritizes correct sizes, but not shapes. This emphasizes correct shapes, but not sizes. This one has everything wrong, just by a little though. So these aren't the right shapes specifically, but it's a lot closer than this. And this isn't the right sizes, but it's a lot closer than that, right? Robinson projection has become popular in the 21st century. Again, the equal area projection. You can see places around the equator are much larger than maybe you would have thought if you had our main geography classroom has a giant map on the wall, but it's of the old projection. Already talked about GPS a bit. Mapping these days, use GIS, use computers basically for map making. We have classes here actually looking at remote sensing. Anyone taking any GIS or remote sensing classes? You're all too fresh into the, maybe after this class you'll be like, oh, I want to take more of that. Well, we actually have quite a bit of that. And Paul Laura, if you're ever taking classes with him, he uses a lot of drones in his work for aerial photography and taking high resolution maps of places. GIS. I don't need to go into that too much. All right. I mentioned that I go over some quiz questions in each class. So I just threw these on here. This is from our first quiz. We're going to see how we could do on a couple questions. So airports that have museum exhibits specific to the history of the city or state in which they are located are attempting to overcome what? Which of these would they be likely to try to overcome? Who says number 1? Who says number 2? Couple timid hands. Who says 3? Oh, that's a fair yes. Who says 4? Well, for this quiz, they're trying to overcome placelessness, right? They're trying to overcome placelessness because, well, I don't know if you guys have been to a lot of museums, a lot of them are kind of identical to each other. And you kind of are like, well, why should I go to this museum if I just go to that museum? I've seen that one. It's like, well, hey, we're going to show you some unique stuff to here to show you how we're a unique place. All right, another quiz question. What is an example of non-material culture? I think that should be kind of easy. Example of non-material culture. Who says number 1? Who says 2? Who says 3? Who says 4? Yeah, so you guys will get these. First quiz is pretty easy, I think. Myths, right? Oh, these are all in different formats. See, now you guys, you definitely know this one. The hippies of the 1960s formed a distinct segment of American society that set itself in opposition to what it perceived as the problem of dominant culture. Hippies can He's said to have composed a distinctive, well, I'll just tell you that one because we already talked about hippies a bit. Subculture, right? Hippies are a subculture. All right, this last one, we'll see how this goes, which is not an accurate definition of culture. Oh, this is a tougher one. What is not an accurate definition of culture? The complete population of a given country, state, or country. The dynamic mix of symbols, beliefs, speech, and practices, a distinctive group identity. The local customary way of doing things, way of life. A total way of life held in common by people, including technology and government. All right. Some decent definitions of culture, but which one is not really? Which one is not really a definition of culture? Who says one? Oh, I think y'all got it. Well, you guys are good. Well, that's the end of the stuff I wanted to finish up for today, but this is kind of like how to go. Usually I'll have you guys do some stuff individually for an amount of time, and then we'll come back and talk about it. We just had a lot of stuff to get through. If you've got any questions, come on up. Let me know.